Well, hello, folks. Welcome back to the CHEK blog. I'm here with our good friend Jator. Jator, it's been a long time. Good to see you again, my friend.
Good to be back.
Um, but we're coming back with a really cool topic, something that I think is going to be really interesting and useful to talk about. Maybe a little pie in the sky, but I think we're going to bring it back to something that I think everybody can really sink their teeth into. We're going to talk about scientific research today and how to figure out what counts as good scientific research and maybe how to incorporate that research into your worldview. Because whether you are in holistic health or you're a trainer, right? If you're in those fields, of course, you're always looking at research, whether it's about nutrition or physiology or, exercise science, kinesiology, that sort of stuff. You rely on it. But even if you're not in the scientific field, right? You're a parent. You want to know about nutrition, how best to feed your kids, right? You're making choices based upon science again, right? So,
Mm.
or you're just engaged in debate with your friends about global warming, right? Again, that all comes back to science, right? So science is everywhere. So how do we figure out what is good research, what is bad research? Maybe we have some biases going on there. So you're going to talk to us about that today, Jator, right?
Yeah, I would love to dance with that topic. Um, and I think kind of the first piece that I would love to share, kind of maybe from a backup view of research, is something that I've experienced in my own life and in my own sharing, my own arguments, and/or my own conversations with others, just generally speaking throughout the day. As I started to notice in kind of self-observance, how often others and myself would use research or what I heard somewhere to platform or to back up what my statement is or my perspective is.
Mm.
And why I find that interesting is that a lot of us carry around what I call this research backpack. And we carry around research that we've heard from other places, maybe that we've read,
Mm.
and maybe, not even read, maybe we just heard through someone else who read, and we have no idea the level at which this person sifted through that research from kind of a research methodology perspective. Because in my understanding, research methodology is a science within itself.
Mm.
And a lot of what we hear or what we see in the media, we just see these kind of bullet statements. And those things are extrapolated from research. But most of us aren't diving deep into the background of research in terms of how was the research done? Was it observational? Was it randomized controlled trials? Was it double blind? How large was the study? How were the variables controlled for? Were they using causation and association? Correlation and association, and deeming that as causation? Were they using surrogate markers? Were they using absolute or relative numbers? So it gets really complex really fast. And what's important for me is to kind of also recognize I'm really into the mental and emotional aspect of all of this, and is that in my perspective, we have our own internal biases. So we will attach, our ego will attach to research that backs up our position and solidifies where we're coming from so that we can counter argue with other people who have other perspective, who are also using their research to back up their perspective. And I find that really interesting because it's not very, at least from my perspective, it's not very humbling. We're not coming at it from a humble perspective. And what I mean by that is, if you look at, the research today and our understanding of how the world works today, if you just look back 50 years, those ideas are laughed at. And the humbling aspect to me is, okay, well, if you consider that 50 years in the future, won't our ideas also be laughed at? Because as our understanding of anything grows, the questions that we ask will become more informed and maybe more global, and we'll be able to ask better questions to understand deeper mechanisms, deeper ideas, etc., which will then in the future make our ideas of today irrelevant. You can look at current research going on right now on the microbiome and how that's just exploding everywhere, right? And this is all over the media. It's one of the hottest topics in current research. What's also fascinating to me is like, even in that statement, I'm super into the gut and gut health and the microbiome. So of course I already have a bias. I'm already super into this other research, and I just said it makes this other stuff obsolete. So I'm expressing my bias and using research to back up my bias and say, well, what about this other stuff? It's obsolete now.
Yeah.
I find that super fascinating. And I think that perspective isn't brought up enough in terms of how our ego attaches to ideas to solidify our own ideas. You know, there's this whole YouTube phenomenon and Facebook phenomenon. There's these gurus or nutritional people on all of these places, and what you'll see is just tons of argument. One reason I don't go on social media that often is because underneath social media, the comments, it's just arguing. Yeah. It's just people's opinions, and they're backing up their research and arguing against other research. And the bottom line with that is we don't know how valid the research is that's being argued about, one. And two, a lot of these people, there's a saying out there, they're called PEB Med warriors, so public medication, medical publications warriors. So you can go on and read research. So what they'll do is they'll go on, find research that backs up their idea, highlight the summary or highlight the topic, and then post that as, oh, well, here's my proof. But they're not doing the background, and they're basing it on, okay, well, this research has been peer reviewed, so it has to be true. Well, that's why I sent you those other articles on research, doing researchers researching research, which is kind of fun, and looking at simply something like the peer review process, where there was a paper submitted to, I think it was a British medical journal, and they told researchers that there was going to be that they were researching them, and as they were reviewing this paper that was going to be submitted to this very top tier paper, those research peer reviewers, I think it was 80% of them didn't find any flaws in the study. Yet there was purposefully, I can't remember.
There's eight.
Yeah, there was 8 purposeful flaws put into the paper on purpose to see if the peer reviewers would catch them. And I think 1/3 did. So then we're basing, oh, well, this has been peer reviewed, so it has to be true.
Yeah. And
that simply isn't true. So I find that fascinating. And that is also back to the CHEK approach, at least from my perspective. What I've learned going through the CHEK system is one of the main things I've learned is, okay, to get healthy enough, to sleep well, to hydrate, to take care of my body, to take care of my mind, my heart, etc., so that I can start to really trust my own inner voice and my own perspective. So when I'm looking at research or new ideas or old ideas, I kind of look through, okay, these 3 lenses. I look through the lens of research, current research, past research, and research methodology. And that's one lens. Then I look through the lens of the ancestral lens. Does that make sense from an ancestral perspective? So that's another lens that I use to kind of consider, does that make sense from these 2 lenses? Yes, okay, we're going pretty good so far. And then the last one that I consider is my own feeling or my own innate wisdom about, does that feel true for me? Does that make sense? And or apply it to myself and have the experience of it to solidify, again, to solidify my own perspective, my own biases perceptually. And using those three lenses to really find and navigate my way through what we're inundated with, which is information. And I think most importantly for me, to be humble about the information I have, because it's simply that. It's information that may not be true a day from now. And I think that's an important thing to remember about this process is to come at this with some humbleness rather than I know you're wrong, I'm right. And I simply don't agree with that perspective.
Well, that's when you first brought up humility. That's kind of where I thought you were going, really, was this openness to my being wrong, the openness to the research that I've been sort of holding on to, right, as my little security blanket, as possibly being wrong, and even more so being open to the possibility that somebody else might have a legitimate opinion, even if it differs from my own.
For sure. And some of these kind of like more kind of grounded ideas around literal research is this idea of correlation and association, which is most of what we hear about is correlation and association. We don't actually hear a lot about causation because causation's really hard to find, especially in medical research. When you're looking at the human being, one cell makes rocket science look like a joke. So when you consider how many variables and how biochemically individual we are, it's essentially a crapshoot. So we have ways of going from observational, which is potentially less valid, at least from a scientific perspective. And we have randomized controlled trials, which are potentially more valid from a scientific perspective. And down here in the observational, we get more potential association and correlation. And up here at randomized controlled trials, from a scientific perspective, we get more causation. And why that's important is, as an example that I really enjoy this example is, in Florida, shark attacks are associated and correlated with eating ice cream, which is hilarious. So you think about that, you could hear that, wow, that's shark attacks, eating ice cream causes shark attacks. And you think about it, well, no, that's not possible. But that's an association or correlation. The funny thing about that is, actually, when Florida is hot, more people eat ice cream, more people go swimming in the water, and there's a higher incidence of shark attacks. So the correlation was ice cream and shark attacks, but potentially the cause was the heat. But what we hear of in research is we don't hear about the cause being the heat. We hear about the association or the correlation. And then we're taught and told that correlation association is the cause. Think about cholesterol and heart disease. That was correlated. That was associated. But there wasn't, if you look at the research, there isn't much causation. And then we get into kind of prevailing biases around these ideas. Well, we all knew that cholesterol in the diet caused high cholesterol in blood, that cholesterol is the cause of heart disease. All knew that, of course. So then when they're doing research with that prevailing bias, that's what they're looking for. And then other research that is going to challenge that bias, because it's not the main bias currently, will get less funding and less attention and may not even be looked at. So a lot of research that we read, listen to, hear of, and people who really dive into this stuff, you'll see that a lot of the research is done on prevailing bias.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another example is H. pylori, the guys who came up with H. pylori being one of the causative factors of ulcers.
Mm.
The prevailing bias was that H. pylori doesn't cause that stress causes that.
Mm.
So yes, does stress cause that? Yes, we can make an argument about that being correlated and associated for sure.
Mm.
However, when these guys were presenting at medical conferences on H. pylori, they were laughed off the stage.
Yeah.
Because the prevailing bias was, no, that's not true and it can't be true.
Yeah.
So with the guys who were coming up with this, one of them got to the point where they were so frustrated, he actually infected himself with H. pylori and got stomach ulcers.
Oh, God.
And then used antibiotics to heal it and get rid of it. Even with that proof
Yeah. Yeah.
of the causative factor, still took years and years and years and years to become accepted as medical thought. And, you know, when you start to consider, you know, this from an ego's perspective, it starts to make a lot of sense of the more you've put time and effort into studying any topic. Let's say you're an MD and, you know, you spent, I don't know, $300,000, $500,000 in your medical education. You spent that much money so that you feel like you know. And people also put you up on a pedestal. Well, you're a doctor, you know. And I'm using doctors as an example. This happens with me too. So it happens all over the place. So you have a lot of attachment to the ideas that you've been taught, and you have a lot of money associated with the attachments to the ideas you've been taught.
Right.
So your ego is going to be much more defensive to back those up, because if those are deemed as not relevant anymore, then a part of you will feel like, well, who the hell am I?
Yeah.
And what I $500,000 on? I'm going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that this does not change. Now, this is all going down, at least from my perspective, unconsciously in the person. It's not coming from a conscious perspective.
Right.
And that's what makes it even more slippery, is that if we're unconsciously defensive and unconsciously defending our ideas and unconsciously attached, then unconsciously we're closed-minded. And we can't even hear, accept, or be open to a new idea floating in. Like, whoa, that is fascinating, and I'm super, super, super curious about it. No. Yeah. I know, because I have a degree from Harvard that I spent $500,000 on. And again, I'm using doctors, but it's not, you know, I noticed this in myself. That's why I'm sharing it.
Right.
I have my own biases. I work for the CHEK Institute, so I have a biases towards what I've learned at CHEK Institute. Of course I do. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying it's something to be noticed and to be watched and to be like, wow, that's really curious.
Yeah. So I guess, you know, let's say you take this position of humility, though. It seems like in a way it can leave you in a very uncomfortable place, right? Because if you have a bias, at least you know where to go to get your answers, right? But if you sort of if you let go of those and you realize, or you start to think, well, look, all of this research might be wrong, how do you go about making choices then, right? How do you determine, well, what is the best, you know, at least given what I know, what's the best nutritional choices for me or for my family, or right?
For sure. I appreciate how you keep bringing me back to the ground. We need some real things to do here, George. Right. You're all over the place.
No, it's all good.
It's all good. I know. I know I have a tendency to just yap. So, yeah, it's a great question.
We're like the intellectual odd couple.
Totally. Okay, so I'm going to give you some root ground stuff. First thing that you could do, which some of the people who do a lot of this work out there in terms of like nutritional work and you know, hormonal work, neurotransmitters, etc., because a lot of them are really deeply into the research and that's what they love to do. That takes a tremendous amount of time, obviously. So what you can do is you can hire someone who is into research methodology. You hire that person as part of your team. And as you're finding research or hearing about things, simply get that paper, send it over to your friend, and then they're going to give you some, variables and ideas around how valid this research may be.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a more ground root perspective. Other things you want to do, I have a little list here for us.
Oh, good.
So when you're looking at research, right, you want to consider, was it original or was there many reviewers reviewing this research? That will also give you some idea of potentially the validity of the research that you can then kind of hang your hat on as a metaphor. Is it observational? So was it, we were just observing, or we were doing randomized controlled trials and really getting deep into the variables and really trying to control the variables so that we can actually find causation. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that observation is obsolete. There is a way that they use observational research to make it more causative, and that's called the Bradford-Hill criteria. Okay, so then we've also talked about correlation, association, and causation. Again, why this is all important from my perspective is as I was getting into teaching, I noticed that, I have to give credit where credit is due, honestly. My stepdad is a beast. My stepdad has 2 master's degrees from Cambridge, another master's degree from Cal. He's an electrical engineer. From a research perspective, he's a scientist. And, he would challenge me all the time as I was going through this process of learning these things and learning what my perspectives are. He would call me on my BS all the time. And I really appreciate that because if it wasn't for him, I don't know that I would have been driven into this kind of exploration of, okay, I tend to be a little bit skewed maybe at times right-brained. And I also have a deep respect for the left brain. So by growing up with him, it was really helpful to okay, if I can dance with him around research and speak his language, I think is what I'm saying here, is that if you learn to speak this language, you will gain more respect from medical community, and that may be helpful to your business. Now, I'm not saying don't be right-brained. If that's you want to just be completely right-brained, yay for you. Or you want to be completely left-brained, yay for you as well. I'm about trying to find balance within myself. So I love both of these. I love my mind and I love my heart. And I think we have those for purpose, at least from my perspective. So I got a little off topic. But watch out for the reviews in the paper. So you want to look at the citations. Do the citations actually support the review paper? There'll be a lot of citations if you go and look at it. They're not actually in support of the paper. So interesting. And were the citations and the results taken out of context, or was there misinterpretation? Again, were they inferring causation from correlation, or was there actual causation? The conclusions of the paper, compare with other review findings, compare that with other papers. Important, the author's affiliations and how biased are they toward what they're researching. So you have somebody who's, let's say they're biased towards polyunsaturated fatty acids being negative. Yay for that. They may, as they're doing research, create biases during the research that will manipulate their research findings. So it's important to remember that. And again, I'm not picking on anyone. I'm just saying these are just things to be aware of. What's the author's agenda? What are they trying to push out there? how much money is in this. So like right now there's a lot going on in the gut microbiome. So there's a lot of research teams around the world wanting to be the first to get statistical significance, etc. That brings money in. So when you have a lot of people going at it like that, trying to get their stuff out there, get reviewed, get it in papers, well, that puts a lot of pressure in the situation and adds to the biases of the researchers in terms of when they're looking over their statistical data, it's kind of easy to make little changes. Now, I have friends who work in statistics and do the statistics for research. What I find fascinating about that is that that is played with all the time. Here's an example. I'm guessing you guys all have TVs, computers, iPhones, whatever it is, and you've seen commercials on drugs. Drug companies, what's fascinating about this is that they'll report the benefit of a drug using relative numbers. What I mean by that is, let's say you're on a drug that they're looking at its effect on heart disease. And let's say it reduces effect on heart disease from 2% to 1%. The way that will be reported is not an absolute. It will be reported in relative. So what they'll say is, this drug reduces your chances of heart disease by 50%. That sounds freaking awesome. Yeah. And then what they'll do is report the side effects through the absolute number. So the 1% to 2%. Well, the chances of the side effects will happen in 1% of people. Sounds a lot smaller, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So the way that the numbers are reported also are very important. So other things, I'm just going to run through these for you all. Long or short term, was it done in vitro or was it done in life, in vivo? Done in animals or humans? Double blind or observational, again. Surrogate markers or endpoints, so using like high cholesterol was used as a surrogate marker or endpoint for heart disease because there was no causation there for heart disease, so they used a surrogate marker as the end result. So high cholesterol equals heart disease. So paying attention to that. Again, we talked about absolute risk versus relative risk. Funding of the study is really important. Looking at the underlying data of the study, very important. And quality of questions asked. Are we asking the right question? Really important. Back to this idea of, I think, well, we were talking about this pre-record was, I've heard that Einstein said this, which is, I heard this, so pay attention to me using my research backpack right now. But he said essentially, if you gave me an hour to solve a question or a problem, I spend 55 minutes asking the right questions. What that means is we look at the research around antibiotics. In the past, research shows that didn't have much detriment to the human being. So it's okay to use. However, we weren't asking the question because we didn't have the information about how important the gut microbiome is. So we didn't ask the question, how does that affect our own internal bacterial home? But with all the new research that we have on that now we can see, oh, wait a second, there's some big issue with that. But we didn't have the knowledge, the understanding, and or the wisdom to ask that question at that point. So it's really important, like, are we asking the right questions? Again, we've talked about prevailing biases in terms of like what is the prevailing bias currently in research and how does that skew current research, and also there's more money, there's less money in researching things that have already been proven as fact. It's already been proven as fact. What do we need to research for? The two links that I posted that you'll post with I think J.P. Landis, who did a research paper on how most published research is false. Really fascinating to check that out. And then the idea about the peer review, very interesting. I think that should be enough. So again, are we looking at true cause? Are we looking at association, correlation? How big is the studies? Is there greater flexibility in the design, definition, outcome? Also will skew how the research is reported and or understood. Again, greater financial or other interest. Prejudice from the people doing the research. More teams chasing statistical significance, right? Money. That's important to all of us, especially from a safety and security perspective.
Right.
If you need to survive and feed your family and feed yourself, let it be known you might skew things, even if it's unconsciously, or your ego might delude your ability to even see the other side, or see these other numbers, or see what you're not seeing. As an example, how many of you have listened to a song, and you're running through the song, and you're like, wait, I didn't even hear the song. I didn't even hear what the person was saying because you went off somewhere else. You weren't present with the song. If you think people are always present doing research and reading over research methodology and sifting through everything and peer reviewing, if you think people are 100% present doing that, well, yay for that. I would say probably not possible. So, and last question: are they just accurately measuring prevalent biases?
Good. Well, that's quite a checklist, and but it does sound like it's pretty comprehensive. And that's great for scientists. But again, like if I'm just worried about feeding my kid properly, right, and maybe I'm not. I'm not quite that sophisticated. Are there one or two that you think stand out that everybody should really be having an eye on, keeping an eye on anybody should be keeping an eye on when they're reading, like an article in the New York Times or something like that draws on research?
Yeah, again, I would go back to the main one being those other lenses. Does that make sense from a historical perspective? And your own innate wisdom. I think those would be the two most grounded ones, and maybe the most important. And then finding someone that you resonate with, who is doing research, current research, and also is giving voice to the research that they do, where they found it, how they do it. That for me, it would be really important to find. Personally, I do that myself.
It seems to me, in the way that most things do, comes back to balance, right? On the one hand, having this open-mindedness about the possibility of whatever your research is being not quite right. On the other hand, finding somebody that you trust that can be that source of research and science. So it's just sort of humility and trust at the same time, that kind of balance.
For sure. And I would add to that last piece, which I think is beautiful, James. Thanks for sharing and reminding me of that balance piece, is to also, as you find that person, yay for that. And be okay with outgrowing that person. And maybe even go into it with the knowing of this person has their own biases. This person has their own perspective. So you can use it as ultimately, I think, with all of this, it's like we're trying to build a structure for ourselves. And eventually, at least in my perspective, which might be quite right-brained, is as I build this structure for myself, over time it allows me to eventually become structureless. I'll plaster that onto Bruce Lee.
Good. I'd love to see that. Well,
So
that's
for me,
that.
it's that building the structure,
Yeah.
and then maybe the more structureless piece is your innate wisdom, trusting what comes up for you. How do you feel when you eat something? How do you, we've talked about in that last one around sleep, right?
Yeah.
The amber glasses
Yeah.
that we spoke about.
Yeah.
Well, I read that in research, and I also read the behind the story research, and
Yeah.
ultimately, I bought the glasses,
Yeah.
and I tried them, and I had friends try it, and they had huge changes in their sleep.
Yeah.
Now, we can get even crazier here. Is that placebo? Well, a lot is placebo. So
Yeah.
let's not even bring that in here, because
Right.
there's somewhere around 63 to 68% that can be applied to placebo effect, and maybe the video on placebo effect, it's really, really interesting.
I like that idea.
However, I wear them and I sleep so much better, and friends that wear them who are completely opposed to wearing, I ask them to try it. Simply give it a try. Boom. And that might be the most important piece, is putting it into practice and having the experience of it.
Yeah.
What does that feel like in your body? And what does that feel like for you? Because ultimately, for me, that's most important, is your wisdom and your experience of whatever's being shared.
You have to be willing to be a kind of a researcher of your own. For
sure.
Yeah. Great. Good. Well, I like that idea. I'm going to go be a researcher of my own here shortly.
Awesome.
Well, thanks for stopping by, Jator. It's been too long, and let's not wait so long to do our next interview.
2 weeks, man. Let's do it.
2 weeks. The placebo effect. I like that topic a lot.
Yeah. Awesome. That'd be fun.
Great. Well, thanks, Jator. Thanks for stopping by again, and I'll look forward to talking to you in 2 weeks' time.
All right, brother.
Thanks.
All right, everybody.
Bye-bye.